Hello, hello. Welcome to the deep and soulful healing potential of our dogs. I am Heather Lee Strong, the Galactic Canine Channel. Welcome to Howling at the Moon with the Canine Guides. This will be a riveting and provocative discussion about obscure things and dogs. Today, we'll be chatting with renowned and certified canine behaviorist Andrew Hale from the UK about how dogs played a part in his healing journey and helped him get to where he is today. But first, I want to introduce myself. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I am a Galactic Canine Channel, and this means that I connect to and communicate with the intergalactic version of our dogs. I write about them and what they have to offer humanity in my new book, Canine Spirit Guides. Here, yeah. These incredibly powerful healing entities provide us with healing tools and have recently shed light on a very specific purpose behind our unique relationship with dogs. So, this fits in perfectly with our topic today. And the focus of our time together today is really just to raise awareness about how important dogs are in our lives and to the possibility that they may be much more active in our lives than we originally thought. I will be offering some free stuff for you. And at the end of our discussion, I will provide you an opportunity to enter a drawing for a free copy of my book, Canine Spirit Guides. And I will also be providing you a service coupon for any of my services or group events. So stay tuned for more information about that. But without further ado, I would like to introduce you to my guest, Andy Hale. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Heather.
Welcome.
Good to see you. Thank
you too, from across the pond.
Yeah. Life, it's amazing what we can do now, isn't it? With I think before COVID, we didn't even think about it much, but now it's so easy just to kind of catch up with friends the other side of the world and have a chat.
Yeah, and meet people you would have never met otherwise.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you have quite the resume with all your incredible work with dogs. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, yeah, I as you say, I work with dogs now. I'm a certified behaviorist here in the UK. I've got a human psychology and human therapy background before I came to working with animals. And for me, the thing I've always been interested in from a behavioral point of view, I guess, whether it was working with humans or animals, is the uniqueness of the individual's lived experience. And how we best work that out together, and that's what's always fascinated me, really. I am lucky to have a position with Pet Remedy as a behavioral consultant for Pet Remedy, which is a product that you can see over in the States as well as in the UK. And I'm a special advisor for canine arthritis management. So those are the extra little strings to my bow. But ultimately, I just like this notion of thinking about the emotional experience, Heather, because we all have one. We all have an emotional experience. And the second thing is they're all unique to us as individuals. And that's the beautiful richness of our individual story, and how I find a lot with my clients, especially, that by being available to the story of another, being available to the truth of another, it actually allows us to reevaluate our relationship with our own. And that's what I love about that. So that's a little bit about me for anybody who
that's a great correlation. I really like that a lot. And I think that's what makes you so unique. You know, you have that openness about you. You have a very specific compassion and drive, yet you're extremely open, vulnerable, and willing. And that just makes you so unique in my view, because it's hard to find all of that in one person.
Well, I think that's an important thing for all of us, actually, because when we think about being vulnerable, it's an important thing for me. Some of the things we'll talk about today. I know we're going to talk about some of this stuff, but you either be vulnerable or you feel vulnerable. Feeling vulnerable is often very much about giving away kind of power and control, and often having the shadow of things like shame and guilt kind of take over a process. Whereas being vulnerable is about taking that control and power back a little bit. And being vulnerable is important, and it's a strength, actually, for me. I think being strong can often be a weakness, actually, sometimes. And I think so, with limits, of course, we have to have those boundaries in place. Boundaries for me are really important as part of keeping a healthy self-esteem, is keeping healthy boundaries about not just what we let in, but what we let out. So it's choosing when you are able to be vulnerable. But it really helps, the things that I share in my own story, I won't feel shame for them because I'm being vulnerable about them, and I'll share them because they're just part of my story. We all have a survival story, Heather.
Yeah.
And we all lose our connection to self at quite a young age, actually, often because of the judgments and expectations of others, actually, and of course our trauma and all the things that come along with these things. So I think it helps, especially in our dog community, for those who are able to have a platform or be able to use that to be able to say, look, we're not all this kind of shiny image that I think a lot of people can put out, when that just fuels other people thinking, I can't be that because I'm flawed. Well, guess what? We're all flawed. So I think it's good to be vulnerable and share that. Why not?
Very well said. I agree completely. So I found it interesting because the canine guides really pushed me to connect with you, and I didn't even know who you were. I had no idea who you were. You had come up on my news feed or my Facebook recommendation for friends. I checked out your name. We have a common history with our names. I thought, well, that's interesting. We have the same family name and we're both into dogs. Let me just friend this guy. Didn't think anything about it. And the canine guides kept nudging me to connect with you. And I'm like, why? I don't know anything about this guy. And so I looked into your profile and I finally reached out to you and I said, let's have a chat. I think we have a common goal in mind with as far as the dogs are concerned. And you're so open. You're like, sure. So when we chatted, I discovered that we do have quite a lot alike. We are quite a lot alike. We have similar experiences, even though I didn't know that at first. But you have devoted your life as a spokesperson for the canine. And as we chatted and got familiar with each other, I began to understand why the guides wanted me to connect with you. And it's your story. You have a story about your own rather catastrophic event involving your health, mental and physical, that literally, as I like to say, rocked you to your core and basically rerouted you, so to speak, and changed the trajectory of your life. And many of us have had a very similar experience. I have one as well. But I would really love for you to share that a little bit about that story and that experience and the very special dog that just so happened to be present during that time.
Yeah, he was definitely present when I was coming through some of these things, and I think it's worth saying, you can put in a little bit of a trigger warning, I guess, because there might be aspects of this that might be very relevant for people listening in, and we all have our own story, and I think it's good to share our story and to put it into context and think about the growth that we have through some of our stories. And yeah, for me, I was a victim to sexualized abuse when I was a child with a non-family member. I like to stress that. And what's interesting for me, this is connected a little bit, I think, with why I'm so passionate about trying to change some of the received wisdoms about how we deal with dogs and how we view behavior.
Mhm.
Because that was a deeply traumatic event for me that I had no outlet for, and it changed my behavior as a child then. So I've gone from being a very studious young boy, very kind of, staying within the rails kind of thing, to a child who wasn't. And what's interesting is this is why we have to change our relationship with the notion of consequence. because when I was at school, my masters just saw me as being now this disruptive child who was being naughty, and therefore there must be a consequence. So I received corporal punishment at school, the cane and the slipper and things like this. And when we think in terms of how we think about dog training, I had the consequence, and guess what? It did work in as far as it didn't take long for me to toe the line again. But actually, Heather, I think about the consequence not in that moment. I think about the consequence being my breakdown and drug addiction many, many, many years later. If I'd have had a teacher, a master at that time who was able to treat me and meet me with some empathy and think, okay, what's happening here for him? Who knows? You never know because you're going back in time. But maybe young Andy might have felt, I can open up to you about what's happened to me. But actually, the consequence wasn't just the cane, and I thought, I better not do that again because I don't want to get the cane. The consequence actually for me was that I felt I couldn't feel safe with an adult to share stuff.
Yeah.
So this is interesting for us all, because when we think about the arbitrary nature in which we treat dogs, whether that's through punishment or even reinforcement, we have to recognize that there is coercive potential through reinforcement. If I was to only say to my husband I loved him when he did things for me, that's quite coercive, isn't it? So this is an important part of my story. So as always, what happens is we tend to kind of adapt ourselves to this new cognitive normal after that trauma, and I did so right until my breakdown, which was my early 30s, and the drug addiction that came before it, and so that's a lot of stuff that went on, and thankfully my parents were able to receive me in that state. I remember I was living in London at the time, and if I hadn't have got parents who were there when I needed that point, I'd probably have been on the streets, actually. There, but for the grace, go all of us. So that's my story, really. And I think, as I say, I'm happy to be vulnerable and share it because it is part of my story. I will not define myself by some of the things that I did in the past. I define myself by how I move forwards from it. And I think that's an important thing for our own health. But anyway, so the point is, though, it took me a breakdown to have to do it. I don't recommend anybody having that, but that was my very enforced moment of reappraisal. So that was my life-changing point. And my father supported me so much. He even came to drug therapies with me and stuff. It was really amazing for him to do that, but sadly he passed away, and because he had cancer. So I was left then almost in a better place, coming out the other side with my mother and I thought, so what do I do now with my life? And I'd been connected to, through my therapist, actually, somebody who's an animal behaviorist, and it was just that. And I was fascinated by it, and I had the good fortune of spending some time with him in a zoo setting, but with the most magnificent of animals, gorillas, mainly big cats as well. So that's how that journey started. So this is the point now, because I didn't have a dog. I thought, I'm going to go into looking after, because it's not like there's a gorilla around every corner. So I thought that maybe there's a calling here to maybe work with animals, and maybe dog training is the way to go. So I started doing my new studies in dogs, but I went to the rescue centre and I kind of wanted a dog that I could help. And they said, well, we've got a dog here who is down to be put to sleep, actually. And it's a very arbitrary thing in rescue, isn't it? It's like, this time, this date, that's when the vets are coming. And so I built a relationship with that dog. This is Milo, my boy. And, it took me quite a while to build a connection with him at the rescue centre, the shelter. And I remember when I was going to bring him home, the last time I saw him, the day before, that was the last walk I did with him, and I just looked over my shoulder and saw him in that kennel. I knew that was it. He was ready for me. We were ready to fight together, and that started it. Now, the beautiful thing about Milo is, on the one hand, I didn't know much about dog training, of course, and I was learning it, luckily in a positive way, which is great straight away. And that's the only way I would have looked at it anyway, I think. But it did interest me, the heavy operant bias towards dog training, this notion that somehow we're going to do all these things. And luckily for me, whilst I was learning the mechanics of learning theory, I had this dog who basically looked me in the eyes and said, all that stuff you're learning, you need to rethink it, because my story is a really important one. And this is the power, I think, because I had to learn very quickly and the hard way with Milo early on, that his survival story was the only thing that was of interest to him. I had to make myself available to his story. I had to bypass my own biases, my own kind of cognitive filters, so that I could be truly available for him. And actually, by being open with him in that process, it was the final bit of my healing that I needed for me. Because by being available to him, I was allowing myself to be available for myself. And I think this is the power of being able to be in that kind of state, really, Heather, whether it's with your dog or with a loved one or with a cat or a horse or whatever the animal is that we connect to. Because if we are to turn up truly with empathy and compassion for another, regardless of what they might be doing, then it helps us to learn one of the most important aspects of our own survival and growth, and that's self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Self-compassion is everything, really, and being compassionate anyway is not permissive, it's not condoning, I think that's where people struggle with it, because well, that person's done something quite bad, how could you be compassionate for them? Well, because compassion is turning up anyway. So self-compassion is about giving ourselves grace enough to think, that wasn't great what I did, but it's part of my story, and how do I, I'm a human like anybody else, and we make these mistakes, and what can I learn from it? So it's quite a story. So there you go. That's a bit of a waffle, I know, but that's my kind of journey in a nutshell. And that's why I'm just so passionate about what I educate about now, really, is because we've got too many dogs who are living a life of sufferance because of their stories are not being heard.
Yes.
And we need to, and many humans are living a life of sufferance because their true safety survival stories are not being heard. They've just become so conditioned in, I can't represent myself in an authentic way because I won't be loved or people won't like me or whatever. So I need to become this version in order to connect to that. And it causes problems for us, ultimately, I think.
That's so true on so many levels, Andy. That just opens so many discussions about dogs, about people, about humanity, about mental health. There's so many directions that your story can take us. And that's what's so beautiful, because all of us have stories, like you say. And my role and my mission, my story, is to bring awareness to the fact that the canines, the animals, are here to help us with our story. Their stories evoke our stories. Their stories help us share our stories. They help us heal our stories. But we have to be open, vulnerable, willing. We have to be in that space so we can see it and hear it. And that's where so many of us struggle. And that's why I was so impressed with you, because you're in that space. You have completely owned it and committed yourself to it. And that's where I would love to see more human beings sitting and residing, is in that space, so that they can hear and see and feel everything that they're designed to, and all of the healing that's available to them. The dogs bring us incredible healing. So I just really love your story. I hope you tell it a lot. I've not heard too many of um, your events, but I really hope you continue to share that story. It's very important. It's hard for us to feel vulnerable enough to share those scary parts of ourselves. And my book is front to cover about all of my scary parts. It's about all of my vulnerability from the time I was 4 years old until now, learning who I was and that it was safe to be me, and many, many tragic events in my life that caused me to shut down and not want to share myself. And the dogs in my life were attempting to heal that and to bring me out of that cave, out of that cocoon. And that's what the book is about, is how the dogs reach out to us in ways that we're not even aware of yet. I had a very similar healing experience with one of my dogs. Actually, ended up being three of my dogs. The dog I have now, my corgi that everybody sees me with in social media, I've had her three times. She's reincarnated three times. The first time I had her, she was a Sheltie. Her name was Mo. She was a male. And when I had that dog, I each time I've had this dog, I've had a very serious medical event. So the first time I had the dog Mo, I had a brain tumor that I had to survive and recover from. And it was also a very significant spiritual shift in my life where I had to kind of decide if I was going to stay or not. And the second time I had this dog, he was a border collie named Kona, and he came only 6 months after the Sheltie died. And when I had him, I was incredibly ill, very sick. I had several viruses, Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus, among other things. And I didn't even think I was going to have a life again. I was so weak and I couldn't even go outside. I couldn't take my dog outside and be in the sunshine. And I just couldn't even see my future at all at that point. But it was a very critical time for my life because I had to totally stop. I had to totally sit still and be in a place of vulnerability. So I was asking questions and I was looking for answers and I was waiting to hear them. Because, we get so busy in life, we don't take the time that we need to spend with ourselves and to do that self discovery and to be that vulnerable and that desperate to get help, to do anything that you can to get yourself out of this jam. It takes a big event sometimes to get us there. So that's where I was in that moment. And because of that, everything lined up for me to be able to do what I'm doing now. All of the dogs came through into my life at that point that I would eventually be writing about, spending time with, sharing those beautiful bonding experiences with. So I had all the stories to put in my book. Had I not gone through that, none of that would have been possible because I would have missed all of those connections. So that illness was very critical for me at that point, so that I was in the right frame of mind, the right physical space, so that I could go through the door I needed to go through to make today possible. And as soon as I found that resource, as soon as I made the connections I was intended to make, I began to heal naturally without any effort on my part. And then this time, while I have this dog I have now today, Gigi, my corgi, when she came through, I was recovering from mold sickness, which was very devastating. Many people in the world are suffering from mold sickness these days. And when she arrived, she was the key point for me to acknowledge my new skills so that I could write the book, the channeling tools that I needed to write the book, Canine Spirit Guides. So had I not ever um, encountered these dogs, had they not been holding space for me, I would have never made those connections. I would have never been able to move as fast as I did. And as soon as I made those connections, I was able to heal the brain tumor, the Epstein-Barr virus, and the mold sickness. As soon as I walked into the path that I was designed or designated to walk, my body began to heal. So it was like a bookmark for me to acknowledge and walk through. And then once I made the connection, I moved on in my path. So healing to me was an opportunity to make sure I was on the right path. But that's kind of my story in a nutshell. Those three stories are all in the book in great detail. If anyone is interested in more about the more of the story on those three dogs, there are 10 dogs in the book. But I find this all very fascinating. And I wanted to just bring awareness to everyone that the canines are here to help us heal. What are your impressions on that, Andy? What have you seen in your life and with your experiences with dogs, and maybe even with some of the people you work with? How have dogs impacted their lives?
I think everything's very personal for individuals, and I think healing, especially, everything is about relationship. Not just the relationship that we think of in terms of physical relationship, like the relationship with our dog, with our loved ones, the relationship with ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
but also the relationship that we have to different things. So part of my healing was changing my relationship with my trauma, for example, and changing our relationship to the feelings we have, changing our relationship to our judgments. It's just about shifting through that. And it can help when you have, an external connection. And I think that's what we can have with our dogs. It provides us with a safe way that almost externalizes part of that experience. Because, I've worked with many people who have struggled with their own emotional health, their own trauma, their own parts of the stories, like you say, the dark bits that are very difficult for them. And they've tried to have input given to them either by loved ones trying to tell them things, or even going through therapy, and they've been very resistant to that. But by connecting through the experience of the dog, it changes that relationship even to that therapy process. I'll tell you a little example here. I do quite a bit of outreach work with local organizations and charities and things. And not so long ago, I gave a talk for some young adults, so kind of, late teens, who had various challenges in life, which manifested in some of their behaviors and things. And I was just talking about the dog and the dog's experience, and talking about the role of the nervous system and things like that, and how we have to try and help them to, we have to redefine and change our relationship with labels and all this kind of stuff. And even something simple there, because I like to use the bucket analogy for the nervous system, because it's a simple one and people can get their head around it. So the more that's in the bucket, the more the nervous system's up. And also I like to use the analogy of little doors in the brain for processing. So if all the doors are open, then everything's flowing around nicely. But recognizing that pain, trauma, emotions, stress can close those doors, and the bucket filling closes those doors. By talking through in this way, there was a young lad there, young guy, with quite severe anger management issues. Really struggled with frustration. Didn't say much. Hard for the key workers to really connect to try and keep him from not falling into a gang style setup, because that's where he dipped in and out of. He just out of the blue had said, do you know what? I think my bucket gets too full sometimes. And he didn't say that to me. He said it to the dog that I brought along. So that's the power for me sometimes. He had a, if a key worker or a social worker or somebody else had tried to say to him, look, you need to try and regulate better or calm down or whatever it is, then that defensive part of the brain kicks in again, right? And so we get angry again, and those kind of rage circuits take over again. So I think that's just one little example of how giving the opportunity to really redefine in our heads about thinking, okay, yeah, I kind of know what that feels like, and maybe that's part of my story too. You and I sharing our stories here today, somebody might think, that resonates for me. Maybe that's part of my story too. Maybe that isn't something that I need to lock away under a blanket of shame. Maybe that is something I need to revisit. And I think, and that's what it's about. It is, and even healing itself, healing is not about, it's not about curing for me. Healing can still leave a scar, right? It can still leave things. It's how we change the relationship to a process that allows us to navigate the world that we are born into, because it's hard sometimes, and a lot of the crap that's put on us, the burden, the weight that we have on us, because of other people's labels, definitions, judgments, expectations, assumptions, it can get quite claustrophobic in there sometimes. So this for me, the big power then working with a dog. A lot of people are already seeing their dog through the same metric that they are seeing themselves, because we're all indoctrinated into the notion of the good-bad continuum. It's heavily conditioned on us that somehow behavior is seen as good or bad, and you're either a good girl or a bad girl when we think about school. And underpinning that is that we reward the good and we punish or ignore the bad. And we're so indoctrinated in that. But when we start asking questions about who is it that's defining what's good or bad, what do those narratives actually mean? Where do those narratives come from? When they're working with their dog, and I think this is why aversive training, especially balance training, is so appealing to many people, because, well, if the dog's being bad, there must be a consequence, right? Because that's what we're all designed to know. And for our own story, that consequence must be that I must feel bad, I must feel guilt, I must feel shame. When we work with another then, and with professionals like you and I and others who are like, actually, we're just going to hear your dog's story, and we're not going to see behavior as good or bad. We're going to see it as feedback. We're going to see it as communication. We're going to see it as part of that dog's lived experience. It does unlock us, unshackle us from the other metric that's pushing us down as well. We can totally recognize I did something externally that I'm not proud of, but that doesn't affect me and my worth, which never changes because I'm always enough. But there are situations there that I need to look back on and change our relationship with guilt and shame. This is the thing, it's about changing those relationships. Guilt is, for me especially, and of course when we work with the clients, guilt's a big one, because invariably when we meet them, often, well, they've done the dominant stuff, they've done the punishment stuff, and now they're thinking, oh God, my dog's actually in pain, or my dog's struggling, I feel bad now, I feel guilty. I often invite them to sit with that guilt, and that's okay, because actually the guilt is a visceral sign of learning something very deeply. It tells you you've learned something really deeply today, and that isn't a bad thing,
I like that.
Yeah, but it's important, I think. That we look at these things as we see them. So, yes, definitely, dogs have that ability for us, and I can't be sure myself, only because of my own life and that, about how much of that is predetermined for me. And I'm not dismissing that. I just don't know it. I'm just very thankful that these wonderful souls came into my personal life and continue to. And, for example, Harley, who's our black lab, my husband and I were going to get a puppy because we knew the mom and dad dog. And I said to Kieran, if ever we're going to get a puppy, now's the time. Responsible breeders, really lovely dogs, now's the time to do it. But we didn't. We decided to get married instead. And we thought, well, we're not going to have time then. Maybe that's not the time. Harley came the following year as an emergency foster from a rescue. And it turned out he was from the litter that we were going to have. So sometimes I think the universe does create these big neon signs that say, hang on, Andy, that was the dog I sent for you. And you're going to receive him. And what was wonderful for Harley, for me, it wasn't about me then, it was about my husband. Something happened in that moment. So when we had Harley, he came as a foster, and we almost lost him, actually, because we were fostering him. We found out that he was from that litter. We were like, oh, that's amazing. But we still had the rescue, the job of the rescue fostering him. And we went to see a prospective family for him. Now, luckily for us, Harley decided to chase one of their chickens and pee on their sofa. So they were like, well, maybe we don't want him. But on the way back, my husband burst into tears on the way back in the car. And I said, why are you crying? He said, I realized how deeply I need Harley in my life. And he went on his own healing part of things. That's my husband's story to tell, not mine. But I can tell you, Harley, he needed that connection, and he recognized it then. So that's another story, isn't it? And who knows what goes on a cosmic level. I'll leave that to you, Heather. But I just think we shouldn't dismiss things out of hand. It's better to recognize things on the level that we need to recognize them. My husband's an end-of-life nurse at a hospice. He's very much his mindset has changed a lot in that job actually, and he's very open to there being a lot more than we know. But what they often say to people is, if you feel after you've lost your loved one that you see a sign, don't dismiss it, adopt it, even if it's nothing as it turns out, but it makes you feel better, then adopt it. So I think we should just value that connection. The more you go into it, I think, Heather, the more you open yourself up to be available to the truth of your dog, the more you become available to your own. I just think it's you can't. So in human therapies, we have the 3 A's. The first A is awareness. So whether it's I'm helping you as a human or whether I'm helping you with your dog, it's about becoming more aware of that situation, the reality of it. The second A is acknowledgement. And that is the hard bit for many people. You can be aware now that maybe your dog isn't being dominant, maybe they're struggling, but to acknowledge that can be hard if your own belief systems and your own value systems are pushing against that, our own cognitive distortions of it. And then we move finally through to acceptance, which is hard, but we have to go through those 3 for ourselves. Become aware of our story, aware of true self, acknowledge that, the good and the bad, and come to a point of acceptance. The beautiful thing about acceptance, it opens the doors to advocacy. We can advocate for that dog now, but if it's for ourselves, we can advocate for self. But coming back to awareness, listening to your story that you shared and being available to it, being aware of it. Awareness is about growth. You can't listen to the truth of another and not allow it to influence your own growth. That's the beautiful thing about connection.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Those are some incredible points. And I really would like to go back to the cosmic connection you mentioned and how our dogs appear in our lives. Like you said, just when we need them and we don't even know we need them. The 3 dogs I shared about all came into my lives when I didn't want a dog. It was not the right time in my life for me to have a dog. In all 3 situations, I was nomadic. Sometimes I didn't even have a place to live. How can I take care of a dog? I don't have a place to live. My life is too busy. I don't have time for a dog. All of these things logically make sense for not having a dog. Yet I was supposed to have those dogs at that moment because they were assisting me through that process. Had I not listened to my inner gut, my inner self, those whispers that kept coming up in my ear, had I listened to the logic of my husband saying, "What? We don't need a dog." Had I not followed my own instincts, I would have really missed out. And probably that dog would have appeared in another way, just like it did for you and your husband. Because when it's meant to be, it's going to happen and it's going to find a way into your life. So the missed connections are really big missed opportunities. I am so grateful that I was able to hear the messages and respond to them and actually find the dogs that were calling to me, because each time they told me who they were, where to find them, what they look like. I mean, I got very specific instructions on how to find these beautiful animals that had a profound impact in my life, and I could not have gotten through those very difficult parts of my life without them, for sure. And now, thankfully, I still have one with me, which I'm blessed because she is a gift. And she is a gift to all that meet her because they all love her. And she shares beautiful energy with all of humanity. But I think it's really important that we understand that dogs are in our lives for a reason. And what I also see, Andy, I don't know if you can share on this as well, but I see so often that the dog is reflecting the energy and the message that the owner or the handler is meant to receive and can't receive it, can't hear it, can't see it, can't perceive it. The dog is actually reflecting that. I think you even actually gave an example already where the child says, "I think my cup is full." Um, the dog if especially the behavioral issues, these issues are coming up for the dogs because they're issues for the person to address. Can you expand on that any?
Well, I can, just from a general psychological point of view, really. I think if we're open enough, especially those dogs that are more challenging in their presentations, there are core things that are really good lessons for us to think about anyway. So already there is the adaptations that we need to make. And one of the big ones about that is our expectations, our relationship with expectation, about what we're expecting and our ability to deal with the fact that, well, we ain't got what we thought we were going to get at this point. You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
an important lesson for us, because remember, everything's about relationships, our relationships to judgments and expectations. And one of the best antidotes to being affected by the judgments and expectations of others is to be less judgmental and expectational yourself. We can't not judge because our brain's designed for it, but it's how we change our relationship with that. So that's that side of things. Also, there's going to be a lesson there about patience, I'm sure. That is there, that we can all learn about, actually, about tolerance, about acceptance, about redefining and breaking ourselves away from the notion of good and bad, and the notion of coercion, and the notion of challenge, and the notion of control. These are big topics that actually that dog is potentially offering us a chance to think about. You know, I've worked with so many clients who work really busy lives. Many of them are corporate executive types who want that dog walk done really fast. Blah, 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 blah. Everything's 100 miles an hour. And I'm like, look, we've got to slow down. This dog is telling us through its presentation it needs more time to process stuff. And they will then say, you know, I see that, and this is my challenge for me. This is not how I live my life. I need to look at how I redefine and change that relationship with the walk or whatever else. And when they do, they learn something from it. They're like, wow, God, I can actually hear the birds today. And I'll often say to people when we're walking along, because I focus a lot on sensory integration for dogs, because sensory integration is very important. That's the ability of our brain to take in information through our sensory system, external and internal. And sometimes I just say, oh, can you hear the birds? And they're like, oh my God, I can. I'm like, isn't that great? Just in that moment, we're just open to it. Isn't that great? And I have to almost, for some clients, because they're very affected by their dog, I have to help them retrain their own nervous system, because their nervous system is already dialed up too much, like the dogs. They're both the same. You know, so for example, a dog will walk in the park and they're already thinking, oh my God, there's a dog. And I have to encourage them to say, take a breath, just look away for a moment, have another look. What do you actually see? Oh, we see some tubby old grey-faced Labrador who's plodding along. They're not a threat for us. So there's many things, isn't there, that we learn about this stuff ourselves, and it is about the things that we need. They're important lessons. What I would say is, for a lot of people say, well, there's got to be consequences. You can't have kids just running right. You can't have, you know, there has to be rules. There has to be boundaries. I get that, and we have to have an element of security within society. You know, social decency, rule of law. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, how is that heavy emphasis on compliance and conformality for us as a species, especially here in the West, with the way that we educate kids? How's it working out for us? With record high numbers of suicides, emotional health, kids, you know, with on anxiolytics, kids who are self-harming. How is it working out for us, actually? Taking away the individual's need for safety and trading it off with what society expects as an output. And I would also say on that line, yes, boundaries are important. I mentioned that earlier, but they shouldn't be barriers to unmet need. And that includes us. You know, I remember my father, interestingly, in those final months before his passing, because he knew he was going to go, when he was able to be vulnerable, for the first time I've ever seen him be vulnerable, he was at his wisest. And he was at his most deeply spiritually connected, because finally, you know, this is when we moved down here in Devon, we live on a beach here, which is amazing. And my parents live down this way as well. And for probably 10 years after his retirement, he still wore a tie and shirt. it could be flipping 30 degrees out there on the beach. He'd roll up his trousers and roll up his shirt, but he had to wear his tie. That is how conditioned he was. And it's a shame, but also good. In those final months, he finally let go of it. And I saw a different man. I saw Brian. That was his name. And I no longer saw the construct that was my father that he kind of created. And it's fascinating. So he learned that at the very end, I think, when he let it go. But again, our dogs give us an opportunity to learn that now, what's worth holding on to and what we need to let go of.
That's an excellent point. And that's so, that just feeds right into what I wanted to say next. And what I do in my work now, I was a physical therapist for 30 years, but now because of my experience and my awakening and my new spiritual connection, I'm now have moved full throttle into energetic and spiritual healing. And what I do with my clients in my sessions is I bring in this healing energy from the canines. They are incredibly powerful. These are the galactic version of our dogs, our physical dogs that sit here next to us. They carry with them a healing frequency that's designed specifically for you, for the owner at that point in your life. So a different dog would carry a different frequency, a different canine guide, because it's a different place in your life. But each dog has a specific healing frequency for their owner, and they're just waiting for us to agree to accept it. So what I do in my practice is I channel this energy in for this person, and it's very specific to them, and they offer them some profound healing that's very, very deep. And it allows them to instantly disengage from the negative self-talk, the pain that we've been through our entire lives that kind of just beat us down. And it also allows us to connect to that very beautiful, pristine, um, godly part of us that's all knowing and full of love and joy and nothing else. And it just brings it in so clearly that my clients are able to heal so much faster. And this is what I do in my sessions. And today I would like to give our audience a opportunity to experience those sessions through my work. And you can do that on my webpage. Let's see. You can go to my webpage and you can get a free consult to learn about how I can help you. You can also read about my services. But for those who are watching this program today and are share about how important our dogs are in our life, I do have a very special discount code for you. And if you enter the term deep healing, all one word, on any checkout, whether it's a private session with me or a group session or an event that you might be attending, you'll get 15% off your service that you are signing up for. So remember that deep healing, write it down. It's just for this audience. And I am also offering an event that's coming up soon. Where is it? Okay. So at the end of October, I have a free group event, virtual, that I'm offering to introduce anyone who's interested in the energetic frequency of these guides. So there'll be a reading from the guides, and there'll also be a mini healing session from the guide that decides to turn up for that event. So if you're interested in registering for that, you do have to register to be able to attend. It is free, but just go to my website and there's a drop-down menu for you to be able to register on my page, heatherleestrom.com, or you can go to this specific link and register yourself. Also, if you go on my page, you can enter to win a free copy of my book, Canine Spirit Guides. I'll be doing a drawing, and depending on where you are, it'll be a printed copy or a virtual copy. So be sure and enter that drawing for your own copy of my book to read more about what we've talked about today. Andy, I just can't even thank you enough. I just love talking to you. You are so insightful, and your perspective to me is just so complete. It's vulnerable, and yet it's very knowledgeable. And I just love sharing it with the world, for sure.
Well, thank you. I think there's two things that I think we can all just bear in mind, and it helps. And one thing to bear in mind: our journeys can be challenging sometimes. Even if you work
Yeah.
hard at emotional health, which I do have to, you still have the ups and downs. But it's just being a bit more, having a bit more resilience there. But the first thing is to be humble, to stay humble, and to be humble enough to think that I have something to learn from that dog. I have something to
Yeah.
learn from that person, and I still have things to learn myself. And then secondly, and this is the big one, I think, is to give ourselves grace to get it wrong, and to recognize that growth doesn't come from the success. Growth comes from the challenges and the mistakes often, and to give ourselves the chance to have those opportunities to reappraise things and look at that relationship with things, and finding those safe spaces. And that can be hard, but in my experience, dogs are always a safe space. So that's one thing
Yeah.
to bear in mind. Yeah.
Humble and grace. Those are our two words for this week. Today's Friday, isn't it? So we'll carry that through next week. Humility
Great.
and grace. I love it. Okay, Andy, thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope to talk to you
Thank
again
you.
soon. Thanks for everyone who joined us today. That's all we have for now. Love ya.